At the edge of Adaba village, where the red earth stained every sandal and the sun burned without mercy, stood a small cement house with cracked walls and a roof that sagged beneath years of neglect. The house leaned slightly to one side, as though it had grown tired of surviving. Inside lived Amara, a young woman who understood that feeling better than anyone. She had been 12 when one violent moment destroyed the only safe life she had ever known. Amara remembered her mother laughing in the front seat of the bus, her father promising to buy her fried plantain when they arrived, and then the scream of tires against the road. After that came shattered glass, hospital lights, whispering relatives, and two motionless bodies hidden beneath white sheets. Her parents had never been wealthy, but their small home had been full of warmth. When they were buried, it felt as if every trace of laughter had been buried with them. Amara was sent to live with her mother's older sister, a woman who gave her shelter but never allowed her to forget the cost. "You're lucky I'm not heartless," her aunt often reminded her. "Someone else would have left you on the street." So Amara learned to survive on crumbs while pretending they were gifts. She made herself quiet, ate as little as possible, and tried to occupy no more space than necessary. But grief does not disappear simply because a child is ordered to be grateful. When the house became cold and her aunt's words cut too deeply, food became the only comfort that never rejected her. Late at night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Amara would sit alone in the kitchen and eat in silence, trying to fill the emptiness her parents had left behind. With every year, her body grew larger, and so did the cruelty around her. Her cousins mocked her. Her aunt treated her like a burden. The village began to see only her weight, never the grieving girl beneath it. They believed Amara would always remain unwanted, powerless, and trapped inside that broken house. They had no idea the orphan they treated like nothing was about to meet the one man whose arrival would expose every secret, reverse every humiliation, and change her life forever. It wasn't greed, it was survival. By 16, her body had grown rounder, softer, fuller than the other girls her age. Her cousins were slim and sharp-faced. They wore fitted dresses and braided their hair with confidence. Amara avoided mirrors. It wasn't just her size that made her different. It was the way people looked at her, like she was a problem that had taken physical form. "Aha, Amara." The women at the well would exclaim loudly, "You're becoming a full bag of rice." Laughter would follow. She would laugh, too. That was the rule. If you laugh at yourself, it hurts less when others do. But it never truly hurt less. She carried water gallons heavier than she was. She swept the compound before sunrise. She washed clothes until her fingers wrinkled pale. Still, her aunt's favorite sentence remained, "You eat more than you work." Amara rarely defended herself. The few times she tried, her aunt would raise an eyebrow. "Oh, you have a mouth now. Maybe you should use it to find food somewhere else." So, she swallowed her words along with everything else. Suitor season was the worst. Whenever a man and his family came to visit for one of her cousins, the house would transform. Fresh paint over cracks, new curtains, the smell of fried chicken floating through the air. Amara would be handed a wrapper and told sharply, "Stay in the back room." "Why?" she once asked at 17. Her aunt looked her up and down slowly because no one wants to see that when they are looking for a bride, that not even her name, just that. So she would sit on the edge of her small mattress, listening to laughter from the sitting room, listening to the clink of glasses and the soft giggles of her cousins. Once curiosity got the better of her, she stepped out briefly to carry a tray of drinks. Her aunt had been too busy showing off her daughter's cooking skills to stop her. The room went quiet. The visiting mother's eyes traveled over Amara in one swift assessing glance. "Oh," the woman said, her lips tightening politely. That was all. Just oh. Amara felt the weight of it for weeks. After the guests left, her aunt slapped her. "Must you embarrass me? Could you not stay hidden for one afternoon?" Amara did not cry in front of her. She had learned that tears only irritated people. Instead, she cried at night, silently, face buried in her thin pillow, praying the sound wouldn't escape her throat. The boys in the village were no kinder. "Amara, if we push you, will you roll down the hill?" They once shouted as she passed. She kept walking. Another time, one bold young man blocked her path. "If I marry you, will your bride price include free food for life?" he asked his friends, who erupted in laughter. She stepped around him carefully. Her heart thudded, not from anger, but from humiliation. At 18, most girls her age had admirers. They received secret notes, late evening phone calls, promises whispered behind mango trees. Amara received silence, or worse, mockery disguised as humor. Yet, despite everything, she was gentle. That was the strange part. Pain had not hardened her, it had softened her. She helped an old woman cross the road every market day. She fed stray dogs with leftover scraps. She tutored neighborhood children who struggled with reading. She carried kindness, like it was the only inheritance her parents had left behind. Sometimes late at night, she would sit outside and look at the stars. "I know you can see me," she would whisper softly, speaking to her parents. "I'm trying." That was always the sentence. I'm trying to be good enough, trying to be invisible enough, trying to survive. One afternoon, everything shifted. Her aunt had just finished scolding her for eating a second piece of yam. "Do you want to swallow this house?" the woman snapped. "You think food falls from heaven?" Amara quietly put the plate down. "I'm sorry." Her cousin Chioma entered the kitchen, giggling while typing on her phone. "Mommy, did you hear that?" Taylor's son said. "No one will ever marry Amara unless the man is blind." They both laughed. Something inside Amara tightened, not explosively, but slowly, like a rope pulling too hard around fragile wood. She washed the dishes in silence. Later that evening, she overheard her aunt speaking to a neighbor outside. "That girl is becoming my biggest problem," her aunt complained. "No man will look at her. I can't keep feeding her forever. Sometimes I wish someone would just come and take her." The neighbor chuckled. "Even a madman?" Her aunt paused. At this point, even that Amara stood behind the thin curtain, listening. Every word sank into her skin. She had always known she was unwanted, but hearing it spoken so casually, as if she were excess baggage, did something irreversible. That night she did not cry. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time she allowed herself to imagine leaving. Not married, not rescued, just gone. Maybe she could work in the city. Maybe she could clean houses. Maybe she could disappear into a place where no one knew her history. But fear wrapped around her courage. She had no money, no connections, no one. And so she stayed because sometimes staying feels safer than risking the unknown, even when staying hurts. The next morning, as she swept the front compound, dust swirling in golden sunlight, she noticed something unusual. A man was standing at the gate. His clothes were worn, his sandals nearly torn apart, his beard thick and unkempt. He looked like someone the village would call useless before even knowing his name. But his eyes were calm. Observing, Amara paused, broom in hand. For a brief second, something unexplainable passed between them. Not attraction, not fear, recognition, as if two people who knew what it meant to be dismissed had just locked eyes. Her aunt came outside moments later, and the course of Amara's life began to turn. But she didn't know that yet. All she knew was that she was tired of being the girl no one wanted. And sometimes when the world has finished underestimating you, destiny begins quietly at the gate. The man did not look like a suitor. He looked like someone who had taken a wrong turn in life and never found his way back. His shirt was faded beyond color. Once blue, now a tired gray. The sleeves were rolled unevenly, revealing strong forearms dusted with red earth. His trousers were clean, but old, carefully mended at the knee. His sandals had been stitched more than once, yet he stood straight, not hunched, not begging, just present. Amara lowered her broom slowly. Her aunt stepped forward, irritation already forming on her face. "Yes, what do you want?" she snapped before the man could speak. The man inclined his head politely. "Good afternoon, Ma." His voice was calm, deep, educated. It didn't match his appearance. "I am looking for a wife." The broom slipped from Amara's hand and hit the ground softly. Her aunt blinked once, then twice. "A wife," she repeated, looking him over openly. "Now, you?" "Yes, Ma." There was no arrogance in his tone. No shame either, just certainty. By now, two neighbors had slowed their walking to listen. In a village like Adabe, boredom traveled faster than wind. Within minutes, 3 more women had gathered near the gate, pretending to adjust their wrappers while shamelessly staring. Her aunt crossed her arms. "And what do you have to offer this wife?" she asked sharply. "I have honesty," he replied. Someone snorted behind him. "Honesty cannot buy Gary," a woman muttered. The man continued, unfazed. "I have strength to work, and I am ready to build with whoever chooses to build with me." The word chooses hung in the air. Amara felt something twist in her chest. Chooses as if women like her had choices. Her aunt laughed loud and theatrical. Build, she scoffed. You don't even look like you can build a chicken coop. The small crowd erupted in laughter. Amara wished the ground would open, but the man did not flinch. I may not look like much today, he said quietly. But I will not always look this way. That made the laughter grow louder. Hope sounds ridiculous when you're wearing torn sandals. Her aunt suddenly grew thoughtful. Not kind. Strategic. You say you want a wife? She said, tilting her head. Yes, Ma. You will not complain. No, Ma. You will not return her. The man hesitated slightly. Not from doubt, but from confusion. I would not marry someone I plan to return. More giggles from the watching women. Her aunt turned dramatically and pointed. Then take her. Amara froze. The women fell silent for half a second. Then the explosion of laughter came. She is perfect for him. Yes, two of them together will look like a comedy show. At least she will not starve him. She knows where food is. The words burned. Amara's ears rang. Her aunt grabbed her arm and pulled her forward roughly. This is my niece, she announced. Strong, healthy. It's well. She needs a husband. You need a wife. Amara's heart slammed against her ribs. Auntie, she started softly. Her aunt's fingers dug into her skin. Be quiet. The man looked at Amara fully now. Not quickly. Not mockingly. Fully. His eyes did not roam over her body with disgust like others did. They did not widen in shock. They did not narrow in judgment. They simply saw her. Do you agree? He asked her. The question shocked everyone. Her aunt's grip tightened. She agrees? Her aunt answered quickly. But the man didn't look at her aunt. He kept his eyes on Amara. Do you agree? He repeated gently. No one had asked her that in years. Her throat felt dry. The crowd waited eagerly, hungry for entertainment. She could say no, couldn't she? But then what? Return to hiding during suitor visits. Return to whispered insults. Return to being a burden. At least marriage even to this man meant leaving. Leaving the house that felt smaller every year. She swallowed. Yes, she said, barely audible. The women gasped dramatically. Her aunt clapped her hands once. Good. It is settled. Just like that. No proper introduction and no negotiation and no family meeting. Just humiliation sealed as destiny. The wedding preparations were rushed and careless. There was no joy in the house, only relief from her aunt. Finally, her aunt muttered repeatedly. Finally, one problem is leaving, her cousins whispered behind doors. I still can't believe she's marrying a beggar. Maybe they will beg together. Amara packed her few belongings quietly. Her parents' photographs, 2 dresses, a pair of sandals, and a small Bible with worn edges. That was her entire world. The wedding day arrived under a harsh sun. It wasn't a grand ceremony, just a quick traditional rite in the compound, witnessed by neighbors who came mostly for gossip. Her aunt wore her best wrapper, smiling too widely. The man, whose name Amara had just learned was Daniel, stood calmly beside her. When the elder asked if he accepted her as his wife, his answer was firm. I do. When they turned to Amara, her voice trembled. I do. The women ululated half-heartedly. Someone laughed again when they exchanged rings. Simple bands, not gold. After the brief meal of rice and stew, guests left quickly, having consumed their entertainment. As the sun began to set, Amara stood by the roadside with Daniel, waiting for the small motorcycle that would take them to his home. Her aunt hugged her lightly, not warmly. Be a good wife, she said. And try not to eat him into poverty. More laughter. Amara forced a smile. She climbed onto the motorcycle behind Daniel. As the engine started, she did not look back. If she did, she might have broken. The ride was long and dusty. Wind whipped against her face, carrying the scent of dry grass and smoke from distant cooking fires. She held the small bag containing her belongings tightly. Daniel did not speak much during the journey, but once when the motorcycle hit a bump and she nearly slipped, his hand reached back instantly, steadying her. Careful, he said softly. That single word held more concern than she had felt in years. They arrived at the edge of town where abandoned buildings stood like forgotten memories. Daniel led her to a small structure with cracked walls and a rusted door. This is where I stay, he said. Stay? Not live. She noticed that inside the room was simple but surprisingly clean. A small bed, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a cooking stove in the corner. It was poor but not filthy. Daniel set her bag down gently. "I know it is not much," he said, "but it is safe." She nodded. Safe? That felt new. Silence filled the room. They were strangers bound by vows made in humiliation. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "I know this was not how you imagined your marriage." She almost laughed at that. Imagined? She had never been allowed to imagine marriage. He continued, "You may not believe me now, but one day you will understand why I came for you." Her brows furrowed slightly. "Came for me?" "Yes. Not accepted what was given, not took what was offered. Came for." The difference was subtle but powerful. She didn't question him. She was too tired. That night, as she lay on the narrow bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, she expected regret to swallow her. Instead, she felt something unexpected, quiet, no insults, no whispers, no mocking laughter, just the sound of night insects and distant wind. Daniel spread a mat on the floor. "You take the bed," he said. "You're my wife. You deserve comfort." No one had ever spoken to her like that, not with sarcasm, not with pity, with dignity. Tears slipped silently down her temples. For the first time in years, they were not tears of humiliation, they were tears of confusion. Because sometimes, when you expect cruelty and receive kindness instead, it unsettles you more than pain ever did. As sleep finally claimed her, one thought circled her mind. Maybe this marriage was not the punishment everyone believed it to be. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something no one saw coming. And back in Adabe village, laughter still echoed, but destiny was already rewriting the joke. The first morning in Daniel's house began before sunrise. Amara woke to the distant crowing of a rooster and the unfamiliar weight of silence. For a few seconds, she forgot where she was. Then she saw the cracked ceiling, the thin curtain covering the single window, and the faint outline of Daniel sleeping on the mat across the room. Her husband, the word still felt foreign. She sat up slowly, careful not to make noise. The bed creaked anyway. Daniel stirred, but did not wake. The house was small. One main room, a tiny wash area at the back, and a narrow space that served as a kitchen. The walls bore faint water stains from past rainy seasons. The cement floor was uneven in places. A faint draft slipped through the edges of the window frame, but it was tidy. Everything had a place. The cooking pots were stacked neatly. The table had been wiped clean. Even the mat Daniel slept on was folded carefully at one end. This wasn't the home of a careless man. It was the home of someone surviving with intention. Amara wrapped her shawl around herself and stepped outside. The building sat at the edge of town where the houses thinned and open land stretched into dry grass fields. A few goats wandered lazily nearby. Smoke rose in thin lines from distant homes as other women began their morning cooking. It didn't take long for them to notice her. Whispers traveled like wind. "That's the new wife. The big one. Yes, the beggar's bride." Amara kept her eyes low and began sweeping the small front area. The broom scratched against red earth. Two women approached openly. "Good morning," one said with exaggerated politeness. "Good morning," Amara replied softly. "So," the second woman continued, folding her arms, "how is married life in luxury?" They both laughed. Amara forced a small smile. "It is peaceful," she said. "Peaceful," the first woman repeated. "Inside that broken house?" "Yes," Amara answered gently. "Peaceful." They exchanged glances as if her calm response had ruined their fun. "Well," one sniffed. "Peace does not cook soup." They walked away. Amara kept sweeping. Her chest felt tight, but not shattered. The insults were familiar. What felt unfamiliar was that they no longer echoed inside her the same way. Inside that house, no one had laughed at her. That mattered more than she expected. Daniel left shortly after sunrise. "I have work in the next town," he said while tying his worn sandals. "What kind of work?" she asked hesitantly. "Small jobs," he replied. "Construction, sometimes repairs." He looked at her. "Then I will return before dark." She nodded. He paused at the doorway. "If anyone speaks badly to you, remember their words are not truth. They are habits. Habits." That sentence lingered long after he left. The days settled into rhythm. Daniel left early, returned late. Some evenings he brought rice. Other evenings just Gary and groundnut. But he never returned empty-handed, and he never complained. One evening, Rain began unexpectedly. Not gentle rain, heavy, angry rain that struck the zinc roof like thrown stones. Amara rushed to place bowls under the leaking spots. Water dripped steadily near the corner of the bed. Daniel entered soaked, carrying a small nylon bag. "You're drenched," she exclaimed, instinctively reaching for a cloth. He smiled faintly. "I've known worse." She handed him the cloth anyway. The rain grew louder. Wind slipped through cracks in the door. They worked together silently, shifting items away from water. At one point, their hands brushed while moving the table. Amara pulled back quickly, not out of disgust, out of unfamiliarity. No man had ever touched her gently. Daniel noticed but said nothing. Instead, he lit a small lantern and placed it on the table. The flickering light softened the room. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly. "For what?" "For bringing you here." She blinked. "You didn't force me." He studied her face carefully. "They forced you long before I arrived." The truth of it made her throat tighten. She sat slowly on the chair. "Why did you agree?" he asked quietly. The question startled her. "No one has ever chosen me," she admitted after a long pause. "Even if this is hardship, at least it was a choice." He absorbed that silently. Then he said something that unsettled her in a different way. "This will not always be your life." She looked up. "You speak like someone who knows the future." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes you can see tomorrow more clearly than today." She frowned slightly. It sounded like a riddle. But before she could ask more, thunder cracked loudly overhead. The roof shook. Water began dripping faster. Daniel stood and adjusted one of the bowls. "Trust me," he said quietly, not looking at her. The words seemed heavier than the situation required. "Trust me." She didn't know why, but she believed him. Weeks passed. The town did not tire of its entertainment. Children sometimes ran past shouting, "Big bride," before laughing and disappearing. A group of young men once stood across the road, openly staring. "How does she even fit in that small house?" one joked loudly. Daniel was home that afternoon, he heard. Amara stiffened, waiting for anger or embarrassment. Instead, Daniel stepped outside calmly. "Good afternoon," he greeted them evenly. They seemed thrown off by his composure. "Good afternoon," one replied awkwardly. "If you are curious about the size of my house," Daniel continued, "you are welcome to come help me extend it." Silence. The young men shifted uncomfortably. "I did not know you were interested in construction," he added. They muttered something and left. Amara stared at him. "You're not angry?" she asked. "Anger feeds mockery," he replied. "Silence starves it." She stored that lesson carefully. Despite everything, something tender began growing between them. Not dramatic passion, not rushed affection, something steady. One evening, Daniel brought home a small mirror. It wasn't new, but it was clean and uncracked. "I noticed you don't have one," he said, placing it gently on the table. Her chest tightened. "I don't need one." "Yes," he said softly. "You do?" She hesitated before picking it up. Her reflection stared back. Round face, soft cheeks, wide eyes that carried more history than her years should allow. She braced for the usual wave of self-criticism. It didn't come immediately. Instead, Daniel spoke behind her. "You have kind eyes." She blinked. No one had ever complimented her face without attaching a joke to it. "They make people feel safe," he added. Her vision blurred slightly. She set the mirror down quickly. "Why are you nice to me?" she asked suddenly. He didn't answer right away. "Because you deserve it," he finally said. The simplicity of it almost broke her. But peace is fragile when the world insists on it. One afternoon, her aunt appeared at the doorway unannounced. She looked around the small room with obvious disdain. "So, this is where you ended up," she said. Amara stood slowly. "Yes." Her aunt's eyes scanned the leaking ceiling, the simple furniture. "You could have stayed and worked harder," she muttered. "Now look." Daniel entered moments later. He greeted her aunt respectfully. She barely acknowledged him. "I hope you can feed her," she said bluntly. "She has appetite." Amara felt the old humiliation rise, but Daniel answered calmly. "I will feed her," he said. "And more," her aunt scoffed. "With what?" Daniel held her gaze steadily. With time, the answer confused her aunt enough that she left shortly after, muttering under her breath. When the door closed, Amara exhaled shakily. "I'm sorry," she whispered. For what? For being this. He stepped closer. You are not an embarrassment, he said firmly. The words landed differently this time. They weren't pity. They were conviction. That night, as they prepared for sleep, Daniel spoke again. If your life were a book, he said quietly, this would not be the final chapter. She looked at him in the dim lantern light. And how do you know? He met her gaze fully. Because I'm not done writing. She didn't understand. Not yet. But something about the way he said it made her heart steady instead of race. Outside somewhere in the village, laughter still existed. Mockery still floated. But inside that small leaking house at the edge of town, dignity was quietly rebuilding itself, brick by fragile brick. And sometimes the smallest houses hold the biggest secrets. The morning Daniel left did not feel unusual. That was the cruelest part. The sky was pale blue, streaked with thin clouds. The air carried the faint scent of dust and roasted corn from a nearby stall. Amara woke before him, as she often did, and sat on the edge of the bed, watching him sleep. He looked different when he was asleep, younger, somehow, softer. The lines of quiet intensity that usually shaped his face were gone. For a moment, she allowed herself something dangerous. Hope. Not the loud kind. Not fairy tale hope. Just the small hope that maybe this life, simple, mocked, uncertain, could still become something steady. She stood and began preparing pap with the last of the cornflour. When Daniel woke, he seemed thoughtful, quieter than usual. Are you unwell? She asked gently. No, he said quickly. Just thinking. He ate slowly that morning. She noticed the way his eyes moved around the small room, lingering on the cracked wall, the leaking corner, the thin curtain by the window, as if memorizing it. You'll be back before dark? She asked when he tied his sandals. He paused slightly. Yes, but there was something different in the way he said it. She couldn't name it. He stepped outside, then hesitated. Amara, she looked up. If anything happens, remember what I told you. Her brows furrowed. You tell me many things. A faint smile touched his lips. Trust me. And then he walked away. She watched his back until he disappeared down the dusty road. She did not know that would be the last time she saw him like that. Evening came. The sky shifted from gold to orange to deep purple. Amara lit the small lantern and placed it on the table. It was late sometimes. It wasn't unusual. She waited. The insects began their nightly chorus. Still, she waited. The food she had prepared sat untouched. By midnight, the pap had grown cold. A quiet unease crept into her chest. The next morning, she walked toward the next town where he often found work. Her sandals kicked up dust as she hurried. She asked at a construction site. No, we didn't see him today. She asked near the mechanic's shed. Daniel, he didn't come. She checked the small roadside shop where he sometimes stopped. The woman shook her head. Not since yesterday. The air suddenly felt heavier. By afternoon, whispers had begun. He ran away. Ah, the beggar finally came to his senses. Maybe he found someone smaller. Amara kept walking, pretending she did not hear, but each word pressed against her ribs like stones. She returned to the small house at sunset. Felt different now, empty. Not physically. The table was still there, the bed, the cooking pots, but the air had shifted. She checked under the bed, inside the small cupboard, nothing missing except him. That night, she did not sleep. On the second day, her aunt arrived. News traveled fast in Adabe. I heard, her aunt said immediately upon entering, barely hiding her satisfaction. He has disappeared. Amara stood near the doorway. He will come back, she said quietly. Her aunt laughed. You still believe that? Men like that don't stay. Even beggars have standards. The words sliced. You can return home, her aunt added casually, but this time you will work properly. No more eating like a queen. Amara's fingers curled slightly. She had imagined this moment before, imagined herself begging to return, but now that it was here, something inside her resisted. I will stay, she said. Her aunt blinked. Stay for what? To guard his broken walls. Yes. Her aunt studied her as if seeing a stranger. You are foolish. Maybe. But she remembered the way he looked at her. She remembered the mirror. She remembered his voice saying, You deserve it. Those things did not feel like lies. Her aunt left shaking her head. By evening, More neighbors had come to stare. One woman stood boldly near the doorway. "So, he has abandoned you?" Amara met her gaze calmly. "He has not," the woman snorted. "Men don't leave without reason." "Then perhaps you should ask him when he returns," Amara replied softly. The woman frowned, disappointed by the lack of tears. They had expected spectacle. Crying, screaming, begging. Instead, Amara closed the door gently and waited. 3 days passed, then 5, then 7. The mocking grew louder. She was too heavy to carry. He found better fortune elsewhere. She thought she was lucky. Each rumor twisted deeper. At night, doubt crept in like cold wind through cracked windows. What if he had lied? What if she had imagined his kindness? What if this had been nothing more than a cruel joke the universe played on girls who dared to hope? On the 10th day, she found it, a folded piece of paper beneath the thin mattress. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was neat, firm. "Amara, if you are reading this, it means I had to leave sooner than I explained. Do not look for me. Do not believe what they say. Trust me one last time. Do that. I will return. No explanation, no timeline, no apology, just faith demanded." Tears finally spilled. Not loud sobs, just quiet, steady tears that slid down her face as she sat on the edge of the bed. She pressed the paper to her chest. "I trusted you once," she whispered. Was she strong enough to do it again? Then something strange happened. 2 days later, a young boy knocked on her door. "Delivery," he said, holding a small sack of rice. "For who?" she asked cautiously. "For you? From who?" He shrugged. "No name." The next day, a woman from the market arrived. "Your rent has been paid for the next 3 months," she announced casually. Amara froze. "By who?" The woman shrugged. "Someone paid in full." Confusion tangled with hope. She had no savings, no secret benefactor. Unless, her heart pounded. Was it him? But how? The following week, a tailor appeared. "Measurements," the woman said briskly. "For what?" "Clothes already paid." Amara's mind spun. The villagers noticed, too. "Oh, the beggar sends money now. Maybe he stole something before running." Speculation replaced certainty. But beneath the confusion, something undeniable grew. Daniel had not abandoned her. He had planned something. She didn't understand it, but she felt it like thunder far in the distance before the storm arrives. One evening, as she stood outside, watching the horizon bleed into sunset, a convoy of black vehicles appeared at the far end of the dusty road. Large, polished, impossible to ignore. Children ran after them, shouting. Men stepped outside their homes. The vehicles moved slowly toward the edge of town, toward her house. Her breath caught. This kind of thing did not happen in Adabe, not unless someone important had arrived. The first car stopped directly in front of her door. Dust swirled around shining tires. A suited driver stepped out, then another. The entire village gathered within seconds. Amara's heart hammered so loudly she could barely hear the whispers. The back door of the last car opened. A polished shoe touched the ground. Then a tailored trouser leg. Then a familiar face, clean-shaven, composed, powerful Daniel, but not the Daniel they mocked. Not the Daniel in torn sandals. This version wore a perfectly fitted dark suit. His posture radiated authority. His eyes carried the same calm depth, but now framed by unmistakable wealth. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Her aunt pushed forward, nearly choking on shock. "It can't be." Daniel closed the car door gently. His gaze searched until it found her. Amara stood frozen in the doorway of the small house, the note still tucked safely beneath her pillow. He walked toward her slowly. Every step silenced another whisper. He stopped inches away and smiled. "I told you," he said softly. "Trust me." And in that moment, the laughter that once filled Adabe died completely because the story they thought they understood had just rewritten itself. And the girl they pitied was no longer alone at the edge of town. She was standing at the beginning of something no one saw coming. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause. Daniel stood in front of the small, cracked house where he had once slept on a woven mat. But the man standing there now did not look like someone who belonged to leaking roofs and patched sandals. His suit was charcoal gray, sharp at the shoulders, perfectly tailored to his frame. His shoes were polished, so clean they reflected the dusty ground beneath them. A silver watch rested calmly on his wrist, not flashy, but unmistakably expensive. The same eyes, but now framed by power. The villagers stared as if witnessing a ghost. Amara's pulse thundered in her ears. Her mind could not reconcile the two versions of him. The quiet man who fixed leaking bowls during rainstorms, and the commanding presence who stepped out of a convoy of black vehicles like he owned the road itself. Maybe he did. Behind him stood security men in dark suits. One held open a car door, waiting respectfully. Another scanned the surroundings with practiced alertness. Her aunt pushed forward through the crowd. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice no longer sharp, now trembling. He turned slowly toward her. "Yes." No bitterness and no sarcasm, just certainty. "You?" She struggled for words. "What is this?" He glanced at the vehicles casually. "Transportation." A few nervous chuckles escaped the crowd. Unsure laughter, the kind that tries to attach itself to safety. Amara had not moved. She felt rooted to the doorway of the tiny house. Daniel's eyes returned to her. Everything else faded. He walked toward her, each step steady, measured, intentional. The villagers parted automatically, creating a clear path. When he stopped in front of her, he lowered his voice so only she could hear. "I'm sorry I left the way I did." Her throat tightened. "You said you would return," she whispered. "I said trust me." Her eyes filled, but she refused to let the tears fall in front of everyone. "Who are you?" she asked softly. He held her gaze. "My name is Daniel Okafor." A murmur moved through the crowd. The name meant something. Even in a small village, wealth had a way of echoing. One of the younger men whispered loudly, "Okafor Holdings." Daniel didn't confirm it immediately. Instead, he reached for Amara's hand, not hesitantly, not secretly, openly. "I came back for my wife." That sentence landed like thunder. Her aunt nearly staggered. "Wife," she echoed weakly. Daniel turned to face the crowd fully now. His voice carried calm but firm. "Yes, my wife." He let the words sit there. "My name is Daniel Okafor, CEO of Okafor Holdings Group." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack the sky. Even the children stopped fidgeting. One of the older men in the crowd stepped forward cautiously. "Okafor Holdings, the construction company, the one building estates in Lagos." Daniel inclined his head slightly. Yes, a wave of realization moved through the villagers. Okafor Holdings was not small. It built roads, housing estates, commercial towers. It sponsored political campaigns, funded schools, owned factories, and the man who once wore torn sandals had been its head. Her aunt's mouth opened and closed without sound. You are a billionaire," someone whispered. Daniel did not smile at the word. "Wealth is relative," he replied calmly. "But yes, I have more than enough." More than enough? The same man who had once shared the last of his Gary without complaint. Amara felt dizzy. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. "Why pretend? Why endure mockery? Why marry her?" Daniel turned back to her, and for the first time something vulnerable flickered in his eyes. "Because I was tired." The crowd leaned closer unconsciously. "Tired of women loving my bank account. Tired of families seeing my last name before they saw me. Tired of being valued for what I own instead of who I am." He paused. "So I left." Gasps. "I lived simply, traveled without announcement, observed." His gaze swept briefly across the villagers. Most people showed me exactly who they were. A few faces flushed. I was turned away, insulted, mocked. A bitter shift rippled through the onlookers. "But then," he continued, "I came here." His eyes softened when they returned to Amara. She offered me water. It was such a small memory. Amara remembered it clearly the day he first stood at the gate. Her aunt had laughed at him, but she had quietly brought him a cup of water. That was all. "She did not know my name," Daniel said. "She did not know my worth. She only saw a man standing in the sun." The crowd was painfully silent now. "She treated me with dignity when she had none of her own." Amara's breath caught. She was mocked, pushed forward as a joke, offered to me as if she were less than human. His voice sharpened slightly, but she agreed. He looked at her again. "She chose me." The memory of that day rushed back. The laughter, the humiliation, the weight of being pointed at like discarded goods. Daniel stepped closer. "I did not marry her out of pity." His voice carried clearly. I married her because she was the only one who did not shrink my humanity. The words struck harder than any insult ever had. Her aunt suddenly fell to her knees. I didn't know, she cried. We didn't know who you were. Daniel's expression did not change. That was the point. A man from the crowd stammered. Sir, if we had known, you would have treated me differently. Daniel interrupted calmly. No one answered. Because the truth was obvious. Yes, he said quietly. You would have. Silence became shame. He turned back to Amara fully. I left to finalize something important, he said softly. I needed to return properly, she blinked. Return properly? He nodded slightly. He gestured to one of the men behind him, who stepped forward carrying a sleek black folder. Daniel took it and handed it to Amara. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Property documents, title deeds. Her name printed clearly. What is this? She whispered. A house, he said. In the city. In your name, her head snapped up. In my name? Yes. Not his, not theirs. Hers. I will never have you feel like you are living at someone's mercy again, he said gently. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Her aunt's tears flowed freely now. Amara, my child, forgive me. Amara looked at the woman who had hidden her during suitor visits, who had called her a burden, who had offered her like leftover food. Forgiveness stirred, but not in weakness, in strength. I am not angry, Amara said calmly. That somehow hurt more than rage. Daniel squeezed her hand lightly. We are leaving, he announced. A wave of panic passed through the villagers. Leaving, just like that, the man they mocked. The girl they laughed at. Daniel gestured toward the vehicles. But before stepping away, he looked once more at the crowd. Never measure a person by what they appear to lack, he said evenly. Some people wear simplicity like armor. No one dared respond. Amara glanced back at the small house one last time. The cracked walls, the leaking roof, the place where dignity quietly began to rebuild. She didn't hate it. It had been a beginning. Daniel opened the car door for her, not as a show, but as a habit. As she stepped inside the smooth leather interior, the weight of the moment settled fully. The same villagers who once laughed, now watched in stunned silence. Her aunt remained on her knees. The young men who had mocked her avoided her eyes. The women at the well stood speechless. The convoy engine started. Dust rose again, but this time it wasn't humiliation trailing behind her, it was revelation. As the car began to move, Amara looked at Daniel. You really came back, she said softly. He smiled. I told you. She exhaled slowly. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like the girl no one wanted. She felt chosen. And behind them, Adabe village would never tell the same story again because the joke they once laughed at had just become their lesson. The drive out of Adabe felt unreal. Amara sat quietly in the back seat of the sleek black car, her fingers resting on the smooth leather, as though she feared it might disappear if she pressed too hard. Outside the tinted window, the dusty village shrank slowly in the distance, the same village that had once felt like her entire world. Daniel sat beside her, not across from her like a businessman, not ahead like a leader beside her. But even in silence he felt different. Not colder, just revealed. The convoy moved smoothly onto the main road leading toward the city. The hum of the engine was steady, controlled, nothing like the rattling motorcycles she was used to. Amara finally spoke. When were you going to tell me? Her voice wasn't angry. It was fragile. Daniel turned slightly toward her. I wanted to tell you sooner, but you didn't. No. The honesty in that answer hurt more than an excuse would have. She swallowed. Was any of it real? He frowned slightly. What do you mean? The house, the rain, the mat on the floor. Her voice trembled now. Did you suffer on purpose? Was I part of some test? The word test hung between them like a sharp blade. Daniel inhaled slowly. Yes, he said. The air seemed to thin instantly. Yes, he repeated more gently. I was testing people. Her hands clenched in her lap. And me? He held her gaze fully. No, she didn't respond. He continued carefully. When I first left my company, it was because I was exhausted. He leaned back slightly, eyes drifting to the window as if remembering something heavy. Everywhere I went, people bowed too quickly, smiled too wide, agreed too fast, not because they respected me, but because they wanted something. Money, contracts, access, status. I couldn't tell who saw me, he said quietly. And who saw my bank account? Amara listened without interrupting. So this was loneliness but dressed in expensive fabric. So I stepped away, he continued. I left the city. I dressed simply. I stopped introducing myself with my last name. And people changed, Amara said softly. Yes. His mouth tightened slightly. Some refused me water. Some insulted me openly. Some laughed. A bitter echo of Adabe. I learned more about humanity in torn sandals than I ever did in tailored suits. She looked at his hands. Steady, strong, familiar. When you came to our gate, she began. I already knew who your aunt was, he admitted quietly. Her head snapped toward him. You investigated us? I investigate everything, he said calmly. It's how I built my company. The truth stung, but not entirely in betrayal. And you still came? She asked. Yes. Why? He didn't hesitate this time. Because you looked at me. She blinked. That's all. He shook his head faintly. No. His voice softened. You were sweeping. Your dress was old. Your hands were cracked. But when I greeted you, you answered with respect, she remembered. The sun had been harsh that day, and when your aunt mocked me, he continued. You went inside and brought me water. It was just water, she whispered. It was dignity. He corrected gently. Silence filled the car again, but it wasn't hostile. It was processing. So, you married me because I gave you water? She asked carefully. A faint smile touched his lips. I married you because you didn't look at me with disgust. Her chest tightened. That's not a reason for marriage. No, he agreed quietly. It's not enough. The car slowed as they approached the city gates. Tall buildings began to replace dry fields. Traffic thickened. Noise increased. He turned fully toward her. Now, I married you because even when they pushed you forward like a joke, you stood there with dignity. Her breath caught. You didn't cry in front of them. You didn't beg. You didn't insult me back. You simply agreed. I agreed because I had no choice, she admitted. He nodded. I know that acknowledgement meant everything. I saw strength, he said, not weakness. The car finally turned into a wide-gated estate. Security barriers opened immediately. Guards saluted. Amara's heart began pounding again. The houses inside were nothing like the ones she knew. Large, polished, surrounded by trimmed hedges and clean walkways. The car stopped in front of a massive white mansion. Glass balconies, tall pillars, landscaped garden. She stared. This is yours? She whispered. Ours, he corrected softly. The word made her chest tighten again. He stepped out first and walked around to open her door. As she emerged, she felt the weight of scale, the house towering above her like something from a film. Inside, the floors gleamed. Chandeliers shimmered overhead. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers. It was overwhelming. Take your time, Daniel said quietly. She walked slowly through the living room. Everything felt too clean to touch. This is not my world, she admitted. It can be, he replied. She turned toward him sharply. Why didn't you tell me before we married? His expression grew serious again. Because I needed to know if you would stay when I had nothing. She flinched slightly. So I was a test. No, he said firmly. You were proof. Proof of what? That goodness still exists without incentive. The words softened something inside her. But you left, she said quietly. You disappeared without explanation. His jaw tightened slightly. I had to return to the city. There were legal matters, board approvals. I needed to re-establish control. And you couldn't tell me if I told you everything before it was secure. I would have risked exposing you, she frowned. Exposing me to what? People who would try to use you. That answer carried weight. He stepped closer. The moment it became public that I married, my board demanded details. Investors asked questions. Media began digging. Her eyes widened. Media? Yes. The world he came from was loud, ruthless. I needed to position you safely, he said. Assets in your name. Legal protections. Security. She looked down at the folder still in her hands. The house in her name. Not charity. Protection. You weren't abandoning me, she whispered slowly. No, you were preparing. Yes, tears finally gathered in her eyes. Not from pain this time, from understanding. I thought. She began, voice cracking. I thought I was too much for you too. The vulnerability in that sentence hit him visibly. He stepped closer. You are not too much, he said firmly. She searched his face for any hint of pity. There was none. You are more than enough, he continued. You just lived among people who could not see it. Her throat tightened. He lifted a hand slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His fingers brushed her cheek gently, wiping away a tear. I did not choose you to rescue, he said softly. I chose you to stand beside me. The sentence settled deep, not below him, not behind him. Beside. She exhaled slowly. Do you regret it? She asked. He didn't hesitate. No. The certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. And you? He asked quietly. She looked around at the mansion, at the polished floors, at the life that felt too big for her old self. Then she looked back at him, the same eyes that had once fixed leaking bowls in the rain, the same voice that told her she deserved dignity. I don't regret marrying you, she said carefully. A faint smile curved his lips. But I am still afraid. That's honest, he said. I don't know how to be this, he nodded. You won't learn overnight. He stepped back slightly, giving her space. But you won't learn alone. Outside, somewhere beyond the estate walls, the world still spun with gossip, in Adabe. They were probably still replaying the moment he stepped out of the car, but inside that mansion, something more important was happening. Truth had replaced mystery. Fear had been named, and for the first time, Amara was not just the girl who had been chosen, she was the woman being prepared. And Daniel was no longer the secret. He was simply her husband, not in disguise, not in rags, but fully seen. And this time, she chose to stay. Not because she had no options, but because she understood the truth behind the suit. The first week in the mansion felt like living inside someone else's dream. Amara moved carefully through the halls, as if one wrong step might shatter the polished floors. The house was enormous, not just big, but echoing. Her footsteps carried across marble tiles. Her reflection followed her in tall glass windows. She had never seen so many rooms in one place. A dining table long enough to seat 20. A kitchen bigger than her aunt's entire house. A staircase that curved like something from a film. It was beautiful. It was intimidating. And it was nothing like the small house with leaking ceilings where dignity had begun to rebuild. The first night she barely slept. The bed was too soft, the silence too clean. There were no insects singing outside, no distant goats, no creaking zinc roof, just air conditioning humming gently. Daniel noticed. You don't have to sleep in here if you're uncomfortable, he said softly. She looked at him in surprise. It's your room. It's our room, he corrected gently. But comfort matters more than size. That word again, comfort. It was something she had rarely been offered. I'll adjust, she said quietly. He didn't push further. He never pushed. That was what made this new life less frightening. The next morning she met the staff, housekeepers, a driver, security guards, a cook. They greeted her respectfully. Good morning, Ma. Ma. The words startled her. No one had ever addressed her like that. She almost turned around to see who they were speaking to. Daniel watched her reaction carefully. You are not a guest here, he reminded her gently. This is your home. Home. The word felt unfamiliar in this space. Later that week, Daniel introduced her to a woman named Mrs. Adabo. She'll help you adjust, he explained. Adjust. Amara braced herself for what that might mean. Mrs. Adabo was elegant but warm, dressed in simple but refined clothing. She studied Amara not with judgment but assessment. We are not here to change who you are, Mrs. Zadabo said immediately as if reading her thoughts. We are here to polish what already exists. Amara exhaled slightly. That was different. Polish, not erase. The sessions began slowly. Posture training, speech coaching, basic financial literacy, understanding investments. At first, Amara felt clumsy. Her village accent slipped heavily into conversations. She mispronounced certain words. She stumbled while walking in heels, but something surprising happened. No one laughed. Not once. When she made a mistake, Mrs. Adabo corrected gently. Again, she would say slower. The absence of mockery was healing. One afternoon, Daniel found her standing in front of a full-length mirror in the dressing room, not avoiding it, not hiding, just looking. She wore a simple fitted gown, not tight, not revealing, but tailored perfectly to her body. Her curves were still there. Her softness had not disappeared, but the dress did not fight her shape. It honored it. She touched her waist slowly. "I look different," she murmured. Daniel leaned against the doorway. "You look confident." She glanced at him through the mirror. "Do you want me to lose weight?" she asked suddenly. The question had been sitting in her chest for days. He walked closer. "No," she turned fully. "Not even a little. If you choose to for your health, I will support you," he said calmly. "But not because someone once convinced you that your body was a mistake." The words landed gently but firmly. Her eyes filled slightly. "All my life," she whispered, "I was told I was too much." He shook his head faintly. They were too small. That sentence settled somewhere deep. Weeks passed. The city life began to feel less overwhelming. Daniel started involving her in business discussions slowly at first. She sat quietly in meetings, observing. Men in suits discussed numbers and millions like they were counting beans. At first, she felt invisible again. But this time, invisibility was chosen. She listened. She learned. One evening after a board meeting, Daniel asked her opinion in the car. "What did you think?" She hesitated. "They talk a lot," she admitted. He laughed softly. "Yes, they do." She gathered courage. The housing proposal in the rural areas, it sounded good. But they only spoke about profit. He nodded. And they never mentioned the people who would live there. He looked at her more closely. "Go on." "They talked about square footage, materials, pricing," she swallowed. "No one mentioned water access or markets nearby or schools." Silence filled the car. Then Daniel smiled slowly. "That he said quietly is why you are here." She blinked. "You see what others ignore." No one had ever told her that before. But transformation is not smooth. One afternoon, Daniel invited her to a formal dinner. Politicians, investors, media, the kind of event where cameras flashed and laughter felt rehearsed. Amara stood in front of the mirror for nearly an hour before leaving. Her dress was deep emerald, flowing elegantly over her curves. Her hair was styled beautifully, her makeup subtle but radiant. Still, doubt crept in. "They will laugh," she whispered to herself. Daniel knocked gently. "Ready?" She turned. He paused. Not because she was perfect, but because she was glowing. "You're nervous," he observed. "Yes." He stepped closer. "They will judge," she said quietly. "Some will," he admitted. Her chest tightened. "But they will also listen." He extended his hand. "Walk with me." The event hall was grand. Chandeliers, polished floors, cameras flashing. As they entered, conversations paused momentarily. I scanned, assessed, whispered. She felt the old heat of scrutiny rise along her skin. Too big, too village, too unexpected. Daniel did not tighten his grip in apology. He tightened it in solidarity. He introduced her confidently. "This is my wife, Amara Okafor." Not whispered, not hidden, proud. She nodded politely to each person. Some smiles were genuine, others were calculated. She recognized the difference now. Midway through the evening, a journalist approached. "Ma'am, how does it feel to transition from rural life to this?" The woman asked carefully. It wasn't cruel, but it was loaded. Amara inhaled slowly. "It feels educational," she replied calmly. The journalist blinked. "In what way?" "I am learning that wealth does not automatically create wisdom," she said gently, "and poverty does not erase it." A few heads turned. Daniel's lips curved slightly. The journalist scribbled quickly. "And what role will you play in Okafor Holdings?" she pressed. Amara held her gaze, one that ensures people are not forgotten. There it was, not rehearsed, not coached, hers. Later that night, as they drove home, she exhaled deeply. "I didn't embarrass you," she asked. Daniel looked almost offended. "You represented yourself," he said. "That is never embarrassing." She leaned back against the seat slowly. For the first time in her life, she had spoken without shrinking. Months passed. Amara began leading small internal projects, focusing on community housing improvements. She visited rural areas with Daniel, spoke to women, listened to farmers, asked about water systems. She was no longer the girl hiding during suitor visits. She was being listened to, respected. One afternoon, she received a message, a video clip. Someone had sent her a recording from a Dabe village. Her aunt was watching television in a small shop. On the screen, Amara speaking at a conference, confident, articulate, radiant. The women around her stared in shock. "She's the same girl?" someone asked in disbelief. Amara stared at the video quietly. Not with anger, not with pride, just clarity. Daniel noticed her expression. "What is it?" "Nothing," she said softly. But inside, something had shifted permanently. The girl they mocked was no longer trying to prove them wrong. She had simply outgrown them. That night, as she stood on the mansion balcony overlooking the city lights, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not insecurity, not fear, belonging. Not because she had changed her body, not because she had married wealth, but because she had discovered something far more powerful, her voice. And this time, no one could force her back into the background. She was no longer the joke offered at a gate. She was a woman building gates of her own, and the world slowly was beginning to notice. The invitation was deliberate. Daniel did not suggest it casually. Amara did. "I want to go back," she said one evening, standing by the wide glass window of their sitting room, watching the city lights flicker below. Daniel looked up from the file in his hand. "To add a B." "Yes." He studied her carefully. "Why?" She folded her arms loosely, thinking. "Not to prove anything," she said slowly, "but because if I never return, it will always feel like I ran away." He closed the file. "You don't owe them closure." "I know," she replied quietly. "This isn't for them." He waited. "It's for me." That was enough. Within weeks, preparations were made. Not for a private visit, but for something larger. A charity launch, a foundation registered under her name. The Amara initiative focused on education and shelter for orphan girls in rural communities. When the official letters reached a Dabe village announcing that the event would be held there, confusion spread like wildfire. Amara. Which Amara? The beggar's wife? No, that one moved to the city. I heard she married rich. How rich? Speculation bloomed, and beneath it, discomfort. The day of the event arrived bright and hot. The dusty field near the village square had been cleared and decorated. A large canopy tent stood tall, white fabric fluttering in the breeze. Rows of chairs were arranged neatly. A stage had been built, simple but dignified. Banners displayed the foundation's name boldly. People gathered early. Curiosity is stronger than pride. Her aunt arrived dressed in her finest wrapper, the one she saved for weddings and church anniversaries. Her face carried a tight expression. Not quite excitement, not quite fear. The same women who once mocked Amara now stood in clusters, whispering carefully. "Do you think she will talk to us? Maybe she won't even look our way. I heard she lives in a mansion." Then the convoy appeared, not as dramatic as the first time, but unmistakable. Cars rolled in steadily, parking in an organized line. Security stepped out first, scanning the area discreetly. Then Daniel. He wore a light-colored suit this time, elegant but not overpowering. And then Amara stepped out. The air shifted. She wore a deep blue gown, flowing but modest, tailored to fit her beautifully. Her hair was styled simply, her makeup soft and radiant. She did not look like someone trying to impress. She looked like someone who belonged exactly where she stood. The whispers died instantly. Her aunt's breath caught visibly. "That is her," someone whispered. But the difference wasn't just her clothing. It was her posture. Her shoulders were relaxed, her head held high, her gaze steady. She did not scan the crowd anxiously. She walked forward calmly. Daniel walked beside her. Not ahead, not behind. Beside. As they approached the stage, the village head stepped forward quickly, bowing slightly. "Madam Amara," he said respectfully. "Madam," the word echoed in more than just sound. Amara smiled politely. "Thank you for welcoming us." Her voice carried clearly, confident, measured, no trembling, no shrinking. They took their seats on the stage. The program began. Speeches from local leaders, formal introductions, polite applause, but everyone was waiting for her. Finally, her name was called. Founder of the Amara Initiative, Mrs. Amara Okafor. The applause was hesitant at first, then grew. She stood slowly and walked to the podium. For a brief second she looked out at the crowd, the well where she used to fetch water, the houses where laughter once followed her, the dusty road where she had stood as a joke. She inhaled and began. "I grew up here," she said calmly, a murmur of acknowledgement. "I lost my parents young." Silence deepened. "I was taken in by family. I was fed. I was housed." Her aunt shifted slightly in her seat. "For that I am grateful." The sentence landed carefully, neither accusation nor praise. "But I also learned something important here." She paused. "What it feels like to be unseen." The crowd grew very still. "What it feels like to be spoken about instead of spoken to." Her voice did not crack. "What it feels like to believe you are too much." Some women lowered their eyes. She continued. "For a long time, I thought the problem was me." The honesty pierced gently. "I thought if I ate less, spoke less, laughed less, took up less space, maybe I would be easier to love." The field was silent now, except for the faint rustle of wind. "But I was wrong." Her voice strengthened. "There is nothing wrong with taking up space." Something shifted in the atmosphere. "I stand here today not because I was the prettiest, not because I was the smartest, and not because I married wealth." She glanced briefly at Daniel, a soft acknowledgement. "I stand here because I learned that dignity does not depend on other people's opinions." The applause began softly, then stronger. She lifted a hand gently, asking for quiet. "This foundation is not charity." She let that settle. "It is opportunity." She gestured toward the banner behind her. "There are girls in this village and villages like it who are being told they are burdens." Her aunt's face grew pale. "There are girls hiding during suitor visits." A few gasped. "There are girls shrinking themselves so others feel comfortable." The truth was too specific to ignore. "I want them to know they do not need to shrink." Her voice softened now. "They deserve education, safety, dignity." Applause thundered this time, not forced, earned. When she finished speaking, she stepped back slowly. Daniel stood and applauded first. Then the entire crowd followed, not out of obligation, out of recognition. After the ceremony, people approached her cautiously. Women who once laughed now smiled nervously. "You spoke well," one said softly. "Thank you," Amara replied calmly. No bitterness, no gloating, just grace. Then her aunt approached slowly. Her eyes were wet. "Amara," she whispered. Amara turned fully toward her. Not defensively, not coldly, just present. "I was wrong," her aunt said quietly. "About many things." The admission trembled in the air. Amara studied her for a long moment. Years of memory passed between them in silence. "I know," Amara said gently. Tears spilled down her aunt's face. "Can you forgive me?" The question hung heavy. Amara could have used this moment for revenge, could have reminded her of every insult, every slap, every humiliation. Instead, she chose something heavier. "I forgave you before I left," she said quietly. Her aunt looked stunned. "But forgiveness doesn't erase truth," Amara added calmly. The sentence wasn't cruel. It was boundary. Her aunt nodded slowly. "I understand." For the first time, perhaps she did. As the sun began to lower, Daniel joined Amara near the edge of the field. "You were powerful," he said softly. She exhaled slowly. "I was honest," he smiled faintly. "That's more powerful." She looked out over the village. Children ran between chairs. Women gathered in small groups. Men discussed the foundation excitedly. It was no longer laughter filling the air. It was possibility. "I don't feel angry," she admitted quietly. "You shouldn't." "I don't feel superior either." He nodded. "That's because you're secure." She smiled faintly. Secure. That word felt earned. As they prepared to leave, the same dusty road stretched before them, but it no longer felt like an exit, felt like a bridge. The girl who once stood there as a joke had returned as a voice, not to shame, not to boast, but to build. And as the convoy drove away once more, the people of Adabe village watched in silence, not stunned this time, reflective, because the reunion had not been about revenge, it had been about growth. And growth, when witnessed, has a way of making everyone reconsider who they once laughed at and why. Success did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, strategically, intentionally after the launch in Adabe. The Amara initiative began receiving attention beyond what anyone expected. Local newspapers wrote small features. Then regional media followed. Soon, national outlets began calling. Not because she was the village girl who married rich, but because her foundation was doing something different. It wasn't just giving money, it was building structure. The first project broke ground 3 months after the reunion. A residential learning center for orphaned and vulnerable girls in a nearby rural community. Amara insisted on being present the day construction began. The site smelled of fresh earth and possibility. Workers moved around carrying materials. Engineers reviewed blueprints. Daniel stood beside her but slightly behind, allowing her space. One of the contractors approached. "Madam, where would you like the main entrance facing?" She looked at the blueprint carefully. "East," she said after a moment. The man blinked. "East." "Yes," she replied calmly. "So, the girls wake up with the sunrise." He smiled slowly. "Very well. It was a small detail, but small details shape atmosphere." Daniel leaned closer. "You're thinking long-term. I know what it feels like to wake up in darkness," she replied quietly. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. As construction progressed, Amara became more involved in Okafor Holdings too, not as decoration, not as a ceremonial wife, as a contributor. At first, some board members resisted. A few older executives exchanged skeptical glances during meetings. "She doesn't have formal training," one whispered privately to Daniel. Daniel's response was simple. "She has lived experience." The resistance softened over time, not because Daniel forced it, but because Amara proved herself. She reviewed rural housing projects personally. She insisted on including community wells, school access, and small market spaces within new developments. "People don't just need houses," she said during one strategy meeting. "They need systems." The room went quiet. "And systems create stability," she added. An older board member slowly nodded. "That is accurate." Her influence grew not through intimidation but clarity. But growth attracts criticism too. One afternoon, an online blog published an article from beggar's wife to billionaire benefactor. Is it all image? The article implied that her foundation was merely a publicity tool, that her transformation was exaggerated, that perhaps Daniel had rescued her for branding purposes. The comments were cruel. "She's lucky. She's just a project. She married up. That's the only skill she has." Amara read the article alone in her office. The old ache stirred faintly. Too much. Not enough. Undeserving. Daniel found her later staring at her phone. "You saw it?" he said quietly. "Yes." He waited. She handed him the phone. He skimmed the article inside. "I can have it taken down," he offered calmly. She shook her head. "No." He looked at her carefully. "It doesn't define me," she said softly, "but it will define how I respond." He studied her expression. "What will you do?" She placed the phone down gently. "I'll work." He smiled slightly. "That's dangerous." "Why?" "Because consistent results silence noise better than arguments." She exhaled. "Good." Months passed. The residential learning center opened its doors. 50 girls moved in the first week. Amara stood at the entrance watching them arrive, some carrying plastic bags with all their belongings, others clutching younger siblings hands tightly before letting go. One girl caught her attention immediately, small dot round-faced, avoiding eye contact. She reminded Amara painfully of herself. The girl flinched slightly when another child bumped into her. Amara walked over slowly and knelt to her level. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Zanab," the girl whispered. "Zanab," Amara repeated warmly. "Do you like books?" The girl nodded faintly. "We have many." Zanab's eyes lifted slightly in surprise. "Will they laugh at me?" the girl asked suddenly. The question struck deep. "No," Amara said firmly. "Not here." The girl studied her face carefully, searching for truth. Amara held her gaze steadily. "I promise it wasn't just reassurance. It was commitment." The shift became visible not only in her projects, but in her presence. She no longer hesitated before entering rooms. She no longer checked mirrors anxiously. Her body had not dramatically changed, though she had adopted healthier routines for strength and energy. But the transformation was not physical. It was internal. Confidence has weight, and she carried it well. At a national economic forum, She was invited to speak alongside prominent business leaders. The topic sustainable development and community investment. She stood behind the podium, not intimidated. Development without empathy, she began calmly, creates infrastructure without impact. The audience listened. I grew up in a village where survival depended on community, she continued. When we build houses without schools, we create distance. When we create jobs without transportation, we create frustration. She paused. Investment must consider people before profit. The applause was immediate. Afterward, several executives approached her. Your perspective is refreshing, one admitted. She smiled politely. It's practical. Daniel watched from a distance. Pride evident but quiet. She did not need him to validate her anymore. She stood on her own. Back in Adabe, things had changed too. The learning center employed local workers. Small businesses began forming near the site. Roads were improved. Electricity stabilized. Her aunt visited the center one afternoon. Amara saw her from a distance and walked over calmly. You built this, her aunt said softly, looking around. We built it, Amara corrected. Her aunt nodded slowly. You were always strong, she admitted quietly. I just didn't see it. Amara studied her face. You saw what you were taught to value, she replied gently. Her aunt looked confused. Thinness, marriage, approval, Amara clarified. Her aunt looked down. It was how I survived. There it was, the generational echo. Pain passed down, disguised as discipline. Amara didn't argue. I don't hate you, she said softly. Her aunt's eyes filled again. I know. The blog that once criticized her eventually went quiet. The numbers spoke louder. Graduation rates, scholarship placements, employment opportunities. The Amara initiative expanded into 3 more communities within a year. And something else shifted too. Young girls began using her name as an example. She's like Madame Amara. She used to live here. She didn't give up. That was the real transformation, not wealth, influence. One evening, Amara stood on the balcony of their home again, overlooking the city. Daniel joined her silently. You're thinking, he observed. Yes. About what? About how strange it is, she said slowly. I used to beg the world to see me. And now, she smiled faintly, now I see myself. He slipped his hand into hers. The world adjusted. She shook her head gently. No. She looked out over the lights. I did. Silence settled between them. Comfortable. Earned. The girl who once hid in back rooms had become someone others stepped forward to hear. The orphan once labeled burden had built systems of support. The laughter that once followed her had been replaced by something stronger. Respect. And this time it wasn't borrowed from a husband's wealth. It was built from her own voice. The shift wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady. And steady things last. And somewhere in villages far beyond Adabe, girls were waking up facing the sunrise because she had thought to turn a building east. That was the kind of power that doesn't fade. And she was only just beginning. 5 years later. Adabe village no longer looked the same. The dusty road that once swallowed sandals had been paved. Small shops lined the edges of the market square. A modest health clinic stood near the well. Solar street lights flickered to life at dusk. Change had not happened overnight. It had happened intentionally. And though Okafor Holdings funded infrastructure, everyone knew whose vision had shaped it. Madame Amara Okafor. The name no longer sounded shocking. It sounded established. In Lagos, the headquarters of Okafor Holdings buzzed with its usual precision. Glass walls reflected movement and ambition. Assistants moved swiftly between meetings. Phones rang in steady rhythm. Inside the executive boardroom, Amara sat at the head of the table, not beside Daniel, at the head. The board members waited as she reviewed the proposal before her. A new affordable housing expansion. 3 additional rural communities, integrated schools, and healthcare facilities. She closed the file gently. We move forward, she said calmly. No hesitation, no seeking approval, just decision. One of the senior executives smiled slightly. Of course, madam. Daniel watched her from across the table, not intervening, not guiding, observing, proud. After the meeting, as the others filtered out, he lingered. You didn't even look at me before approving it. He teased lightly. She leaned back in her chair. I didn't need to. He smiled. You're dangerous now. She raised an eyebrow. I was always dangerous. He laughed softly. Yes, she had been. They just hadn't recognized it. Her foundation had grown beyond Nigeria, partnerships with international organizations, scholarship programs abroad, mentorship initiatives. But what she guarded most fiercely was its core mission, dignity first. One afternoon, she visited the original learning center, the first one they built. The girls gathered excitedly when her car pulled in. Madame Amara. They ran toward her, laughter ringing in the air. She knelt easily among them, no longer self-conscious about how she looked doing so. Her body had changed over the years, stronger now, healthier, but still unmistakably hers. She never chased thinness. She chased strength. A teenage girl approached hesitantly. Ma, can I ask you something? Of course, Amara replied warmly. Were you ever ashamed? The question was fragile. Honest, Amara considered it carefully. Yes, she said. The girl's eyes widened slightly. But shame is taught, Amara continued. And what is taught can be unlearned. The girl absorbed that quietly. How did you unlearn it? Amara smiled softly. I stopped asking permission to exist. The sentence hung in the air like something sacred. Back in Adabe, her aunt now ran a small catering business funded by a grant from the Amara initiative. It had not been charity. It had been opportunity. Her aunt had changed too. Age softened pride. Regret softened ego. One evening, as Amara visited the village alone, no convoy, no media, she stopped by her aunt's small kitchen. The smell of stew filled the air. You came without announcing, her aunt said, surprised. I wanted to, Amara replied simply. They sat outside on wooden stools. For a while, they spoke of ordinary things. Weather, market prices, village weddings. Finally, her aunt looked at her carefully. They respect you now, she said quietly. Amara tilted her head. Respect is not revenge, she replied. Her aunt nodded slowly. I used to think marriage was the only rescue, the older woman admitted. I was wrong. Amara studied her face. Marriage didn't rescue me, she said gently. What did? She smiled faintly, believing I was worth more than survival. Her aunt swallowed. I didn't know how to teach that. I know, Amara said softly, and she meant it. Years earlier, she had stood at a gate as a joke. Now, she stood at podiums as a leader. But the most important transformation wasn't visible in headlines. It was internal. One evening, as rain fell gently over Legos, she and Daniel sat on the balcony, the same one where she once felt uncertain. The city lights shimmered below. Do you ever think about that day? Daniel asked quietly. Which one? The gate. She smiled slowly sometimes, and she leaned her head lightly against the back of the chair. I don't feel embarrassed anymore. He waited. I feel grateful. He looked at her surprised. For being mocked, for surviving it, she clarified. Rain tapped softly against the glass railing. If they had celebrated me then, she continued, I might have believed my value depended on their approval. He nodded slowly, and now she looked out over the city. My value isn't negotiable. The words were simple, unshakable. A few months later, she received an award, National Humanitarian Leader of the Year. The ceremony was televised. As she walked across the stage to accept it, the applause was thunderous. But what caught her attention most was not the audience in the hall. It was the camera feed projected on the large screen behind her. In small split frames, communities across the country watched live. Among them, at a bee village, women at the market, children at the learning center, her aunt sitting proudly in front of a small television. Amara took the microphone. This recognition does not belong to me alone, she began calmly. It belongs to every girl who was told she was too much. Her voice was steady. It belongs to every child who learned to shrink to survive. The room was silent. You are not too much, she said clearly. You were simply surrounded by people who could not measure your worth. Applause erupted, but Amara was not finished. The greatest transformation is not moving from poverty to wealth, she said. It is moving from self-doubt to self-trust. The audience rose to its feet. The standing ovation filled the hall, but something even more important settled inside Amara: closure. Later that night, after the cameras were gone and the applause had faded, she stood alone in her dressing room holding the award. She was not smiling widely. She was remembering. There had been a time when she believed her story would end with humiliation, forced marriage, mockery, and rejection. Now she understood that a beginning can look like an ending when you cannot yet see beyond the pain. Daniel entered quietly. "You did well," he said. Amara placed the award on the table. "Do you know what is funny?" "What?" "Everyone thinks marrying you changed my life." Daniel smiled faintly. "Didn't it?" "It gave me an opportunity," she said, stepping closer. Then she placed a hand over her heart. "But this is what changed my life." "Your heart?" he asked. "My belief in myself," she corrected softly. Daniel nodded. He understood. Years later, children across Adabe would grow up hearing Amara's story, not as gossip, but as legend. She was no longer remembered as the fat orphan, the unwanted girl, or the bride people mocked. She became the woman who built doors where walls had once stood, the woman who returned without bitterness, and the woman who proved that dignity is not something others grant you. It is something you claim. The people who once laughed at her were not ashamed because Amara humiliated them. They were ashamed because she never did. That was the difference. Power used for revenge burns quickly. Power used to build can last for generations. Amara Okafor was no longer the girl no one wanted. She was the woman everyone had underestimated. And in the end, that was their greatest mistake.